Let's talk about Vim. It's a text editor that can be initially a little bit obtuse, but it's very valuable to learn, and it's available almost anywhere that you're going to be working in a command line interface. To understand Vim, I think it helps to have a sense of what its history is. So let's get into the history of Vim first. So what is Vim? Well, it's VI improved, but that doesn't have a lot of meaning if we don't know what VI is, right? So what is VI? VI stands for visual. It was a visual text editor. And I think that begs the question, what is a non-visual text editor? Because it's hard to imagine, as someone who has spent their time learning how to program in the late 20-teens, in 2020, thinking about how would I work in a text editor that wasn't visual? That doesn't seem to make any sense. So we have to go way back to one of the original text editors in Unix, Ed. In fact, it's the original text editor in Unix, and it was named Ed. As you're starting to get a sense, VI, Ed, most of the early utilities had very short names, ls, cd, or other commands that you've learned, because they wanted getting around and navigating the system to be very efficient, so they went with cryptic short names for their utility programs. So let me give you an example of an Ed session, and let's work through it. So with Ed, you can open it up, and Ed is actually still available in every Unix-based system. It's a standard POSIX utility software. I'm going to warn you, it's pretty wild to interact with. So I'm actually going to clear my screen here so we can see a full screen of text and open Ed, right? And when you're in Ed, you get the opportunity to go between modes, where right now we're in sort of this command mode. But if I say A for append, I'm now going to be in an append mode where the next lines of text that I type will be added to my text file. So I could say this is an example of the Ed editor. You are now adding lines to a buffer. End mode by end, let's say insert mode or append mode, with a period on its own line. All right, and I enter that period, and boom, now I'm back in a command mode. So we just went into an append mode. We added some text to this buffer, and we're thinking of a buffer as like an arbitrary length array of lines of text. And now if I wanted to save this file that I'm working in, remember I'm working in a text editor. This is the original editor. And I say w example.txt. And that number that is printed back to us is the number of bytes that were written to our disk and saved to storage, right? And so, okay, well, how do we see what we've got? Well, we can use some commands to print out the contents of our buffer. So I could say 1p to print, to say line 1, print that line. We can do a range of lines 1 through 3, print, and we can access the contents of our buffer with this little command language. We can use a different command. So that was P for print. I can delete line 2 with 2D. And then if I print lines 1 through 2, because there's only 2 now, notice that middle line, you are now adding lines to a buffer, is gone. I can also, I'll just quit at this point. I mean, you kind of get the point. So when you are working in Ed, it's a pretty cryptic place to be. And it turns out we're not going to spend any time here, but it's, I think, valuable to see where this all began. And we're coming from a place where this was the primary modality of editing in the late 60s, early 70s. So Ed was invented in the same month that Woodstock took place, and Ken Thompson, the creator of the Unix operating system and a lead creator of the C programming language, was the original author of Ed. In fact, they used Ed to iterate on the C programming language and the Unix operating system. And if you can imagine like what it takes to work in this mode to edit programs that are as complex as operating systems, if they can do that, we should be able to do anything, right? These people were legends. And so this is just a quick demo to have a sense of what it takes in early editors to get around. And so this is what we would think of as a non-visual editor, because Our buffer is stored behind the scenes. We're not looking at it and editing our buffer directly in the same way that you're used to in a modern text editor. So people realized within the first 10 years that, hey, there must be a better way. And so VI came about, which was the visual text editor. And Vim is an extension of VI that was invented or created in the early 90s and has been iterated on and improved ever since. And now there's some new forks of Vim that are trying to do various things. But its lineage traces all the way back to that original editor. Vim is a modal editor, so even though it's visual, there are still modes where we'll be adding text or inserting it, and the keys that we type are actually having an impact on the text in our document, versus a mode where we're actually giving commands and speaking a little language that is Vim's language to modify and manipulate our documents. So the 4 modes that we'll learn about are normal mode. This is the mode where you're giving commands, like you're deleting lines, you're changing lines, you're searching for things. We'll get to this in a future video. Insert mode is when you're directly inserting into the buffer. And so that's like when you're typing and you're seeing your text show up interactively. There's a mode called visual mode that allows you to select blocks of text at a time and work on blocks of text. This is a lot like dragging your mouse around, but it turns out there are some even more powerful ways we can work in visual mode than we can in most editors with a mouse. And then there's actually a 4th mode, which is the X mode, which is based on the command language of ed. So you can write ed commands that are valid ed commands in Vim, and they still have meaning today, which is pretty cool to see this traced over the last 50 years. So what does having a grammar have to do with a text editor? In the text editors you're used to using, such as VS Code or Eclipse, they don't have grammars associated with navigating around, not in the way that Vim does. With a well-designed grammar, what you're going to find is that you can compose and express ideas that would be impossible without a grammar. Like languages, we're going to need to practice this, and it's going to take some time to get comfortable with. We're going to have to develop fluency in being able to work in the grammar and the language of Vim. But once you are comfortable in it, you're going to find that there are things that you can do that you can't even imagine right now because you don't have a language for thinking in those terms. And so it's an exciting intellectual endeavor that pays dividends in the extra ability that you're going to have in being able to navigate and edit code more efficiently and effectively than you could before you knew this language. So Vim is a text editor that is grammar driven, and you're going to find that it does have a learning curve associated with it, but we're going to practice as we get comfortable with it. And within a month or 2, I think you're going to look back and wonder, wow, how was I even doing this before without knowing how to work with Vim's language and grammar? That's a quick overview on the history of Vim. It's valuable to learn because you can use this same command language as plugins to other IDEs. Like you can use Vim syntax and navigation in VS Code if you install a Vim plugin. Same with Eclipse, same with IntelliJ. Any modern IDE has a Vim mode plugin that you can enable to work in this way. But we're going to use Vim proper to get comfortable with navigating text editing in a command line environment.